Right, let's dive straight into the heart of medieval thought, language and logic. You can't really grasp what these thinkers were up to without understanding how they tackled words and reasoning. It wasn't just an academic exercise, it was fundamental to everything they wrote and thought. Think of it as the operating system for their entire intellectual world. So we're looking at a landscape incredibly rich and complex when it comes to medieval ideas about language and logic. Trying to cover it all in one go is like trying to map the entire universe with a single sheet of paper. What we'll do is get a quick bird's eye view first, then zoom in on some key themes that really shape the conversation. The whole educational framework, the seven liberal arts grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, laid this out. Augustine kicked things off in his De Ordine, seeing these arts as the training wheels for the soul's journey towards understanding the divine. And Marcianus Capella later painted this vivid picture in his poem, Mercury representing the logos, the word/reason, marrying philology, who embodies these seven arts. It sets the stage perfectly. Let's start with grammar. The heavyweight champion here was Priscian, writing way back in the 6th century Constantinople. His institution's Grammaticae was massive, systematic, and quite revolutionary for its time. What made him special? He approached grammar semantically. Instead of saying a noun is a word that does X function in a sentence, he'd say a noun signifies Y meaning. Think about that, a focus on meaning from the get-go. Then there was Donatus, earlier still, whose work included training in figures of speech, which Priscian kind of skipped over. Fast forward to the 12th century, and Peter Helias drops his Summa Super Priscianum. This wasn't just a commentary, it was the first full-blown textbook summary summa on any subject. And notice the shift. Helias starts classifying parts of speech based on their linguistic properties, their modes of signification modi significandi. Suddenly, grammar feels less like philosophy and more like linguistics. The university courses started favoring Priscian's minor books on syntax, and newer, more practical teaching grammars in verse form, like Villa Deis Doctrinale, took over from Donatus, staying popular right through the Middle Ages. But wait, just as things seem to be settling into this more linguistic mode, bam! Late 13th century, the speculative grammarians, or modistae, crashed the party. They wanted to bring back the philosophical rigor, making grammar look like a proper Aristotelian science. Their big idea: find what's universal across all languages. And they found it in this neat parallel. The ways things exist, modi essendi, the ways we understand them, modi intelligenti, and the ways words signify them, modi significandi. It's like finding the underlying code. Now don't think they believed language is just a mirror reflecting reality. No, they saw that once our minds create these modes of signifying, we can play around with them. Take chimera for fictional, sure, but it's treated like a substance word. Or movement, it signifies change but behaves like a stable noun. This focus on universality and the mind's role in creating meaning pushed speculative grammar further away from everyday spoken language, especially by the 14th century. It became more abstract, more about the structure of thought itself. Now, let's switch gears to logic, the art that underwent the most dramatic transformations. In the early days, the toolkit was pretty limited. We had bits and pieces from Marius Victorinus, a famous text wrongly credited to Augustine, the Categoria Decem, which was huge in the 9th and 10th centuries, Augustine's own work on dialectic, and stuff scattered in encyclopedias. But the real game changer? Boethius. This guy was the bridge. He translated Aristotle's core logical works into Latin, luckily most survived. Brought over Porphyry's Isagoge as a guide to Aristotle's categories, wrote commentaries, and even penned his own monographs on topics like division and hypothetical syllogisms. His work on division was particularly influential. By the late 10th century, Gerbert of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, was already teaching this stuff in rhymes. The basic curriculum solidified by the 12th century, adding Gilbert of Poitiers' Liber Sex Principiorum, became known as the Logica Vetus, the Old Logic. It was the foundation, but things were about to get shaken up. Around 1150, the intellectual world exploded. Imagine rediscovering lost libraries. That's kind of what happened with logic. The rest of Aristotle's logical corpus, plus other crucial texts, came back into circulation. Thinkers started building on this foundation, creating entirely new areas of study. By the 1130s, works like Aristotle's Topics and Sophistical Refutations were known. And by 1159, John of Salisbury mentions all four of Aristotle's Analytics in his Metalogicon. The entire Logica Nova was back. But it didn't stop there. From the second half of the 12th century, scholars started digging into Arabic logic, translating works by Avicenna and later Averroes. Greek commentators also joined the fray. Suddenly, there was a wealth of material, enough to build a proper, structured logic curriculum for the burgeoning universities. The floodgates were open. Okay, so Aristotle was still king, but he didn't have all the answers. This created space for innovation, all kicking off in the latter half of the 12th century. The biggest development, terminist logic. This sounds fancy, but it's basically about how words refer in sentences. Think supposition theory, figuring out what a term like man actually stands for in every man is running. This naturally led to studies of syncategoremata, all those little words like every, not, and, that aren't nouns or verbs but are crucial. Beyond that, we saw intense focus on insolubles, those mind-bending semantic paradoxes, obligations rules for fair debate, and consequences, figuring out valid arguments. How did people learn all this? Not just through lectures but through comprehensive textbooks, the Summe. Think William of Sherwood, Peter of Spain, Roger Bacon laying out the whole system. Later giants like Occam and Buridan followed suit. Some places, like Oxford and Cambridge, preferred collections of shorter treatises, like Paul of Venice's Logica Parva. And weaving through all this was the technique of analyzing sophismata, logical puzzles, designed to test and sharpen understanding. Let's talk about these sophismata. They were the medieval equivalent of brain teasers. A sophisma sentence was specifically crafted to highlight a tricky problem, a subtle concept, or a general difficulty. For example, in logic, every phoenix exists. Okay, but only one can exist at a time. Or Socrates is whiter than Plato begins to be white. Mind-bending. In grammar, they tackled things like, love is a verb, is love an action or a feeling? Or sentences starting with proc dolor, oh the pain. Here you've got an interjection expressing pain naturally, mixed with a noun referring to pain conventionally. By the end of the 12th century, these sophismata were everywhere, even in dedicated treatises. Typically, you'd start with the puzzle, use formal disputational techniques to show how seemingly sound reasoning could lead to absurd conclusions, and then either solve it by pointing out a grammatical or logical distinction, or dissolve it by showing different senses or truth values. These weren't just written exercises. They were part of the oral training, sharpening students' reasoning skills in real-time debate. So, what was the big picture regarding the purpose of language and logic? Both were seen primarily as cognitive tools. Language's job? To state the truth. Logic's job? To guide us from one truth to another. Simple enough, right? Well, not quite. This led to fascinating tensions, especially visible in thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine, the rhetorician, was deeply skeptical about how well speech could capture truth. He knew language's power but also its pitfalls. He even argued in The Teacher that we need to move beyond ordinary speech to truly discern from Christ, the inner teacher and divine word. Aquinas, though, was more optimistic. He believed language's proper function is to reveal truth by making our concepts known. Speech is essential for society, for sharing notions of good and bad, just and unjust, and society itself rests on truth-telling. His main view seems closer to the later modiste, language as a rational, rule-governed system, studied in isolation, focusing on propositions as units of information for building knowledge. This implies that meaningful speech needs well-formed sentences, matching concepts, aiming for truth. Other functions like commanding or praying, leave those to rhetoric and poetry. However, Aquinas wasn't blind to other aspects. He acknowledged language's expressive power. Praise isn't just stating opinion, it aims to provoke action. He recognized performative utterances like, I baptize you. And crucially, he stressed how human intentions can fix errors, like slips of the tongue. When it came to logic, everyone agreed it was fundamentally about truth. Augustine explicitly stated that the business of dialectic is to discern the truth. Avicenna added that logic's job is to take us from the known to the unknown. Importantly, nobody was thinking about logic in terms of formal systems like we do today. Even though they used technical language, it was to clarify distinctions in meaning, not to define abstract formal structures. This meant there was no system-relative definition of formality. Instead, a formally valid inference was simply one that obviously preserves truth. Augustine put it beautifully. The validity of inference isn't invented by humans, it's divinely instituted in the reasonable order of things. Of course, this didn't mean everyone agreed on what counted as valid, or that all inferences were equally useful. They knew premises had to be true, and ambiguity was a major source of error. Hence, a huge chunk of logical discussion was dedicated to studying fallacies and how to avoid them. Now, here's a fascinating twist. Logic doesn't always have to rely on formal step-by-step inference to aim for truth. Think about Neoplatonic dialectic. Its goal wasn't just logical validity, but to elevate the soul, to lead it upwards until it could directly perceive intelligible reality. Augustine's proof for God's existence in On Free Choice of the Will is a prime example of this dialectical ascent. Anselm, too, with his ontological argument, though really more about greatness than being, seems to aim for this same transcendence, putting the soul in a position to grasp reality beyond mere words. However, unlike Augustine, Anselm was also a meticulous logician. His arguments, like the ontological one or those in the Monologion, are structured as formal proofs, often using classic techniques like reductio ad absurdum. He presents them as complete arguments with premises and conclusions. So Anselm shows us that this Neoplatonic aspiration doesn't necessarily contradict rigorous logical procedure. They can coexist. Let's unpack the terms themselves. Dialectic had several meanings. Broadly, it just meant logic, and this was common until the 13th century. Narrower senses included dialectic as the art of debating well, Cicero, Augustine, dialectic as the art of finding argument material related to the topics, and dialectic as a specific type of reasoning, often topical syllogisms. Similarly, logica comes from logos, meaning word or reason. So it could be seen as a linguistic science, scientia sermosionalis, or a scientific rationalis. Both titles had support. The Stoics grouped philosophy into parts, including rational, which Boethius linked to logic. But since logic was part of the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, it looked like a linguistic science. This view got a boost from Arabic logicians, who sometimes included rhetoric and poetics under logic. However, by the late 13th and 14th centuries, the idea of logic as purely rational science gained dominance. Why? Partly because the rediscovery of Aristotle's posterior analytics shifted focus towards demonstrative science. This raised a puzzle. If science deals with universal truths about being, how can studying fallacies or individual arguments qualify as science? It seemed like an odd fit. So, how did logicians justify calling their field a science despite the fallacy focus? They came up with a clever solution, similar to how the modistae handled grammar. They argued that logic is indeed a science for two main reasons. First, it studies universal, necessary principles that govern all logical phenomena, including why fallacies fail. Second, and this is crucial, they broadened the concept of being ends. It wasn't just about physical objects. It included beings of reason, things that exist because of the mind's activity. Think fictional creatures like chimeras, impossible things like golden mountains, but also higher-level concepts like genus, species, subject, predicate, and yes, the syllogism itself. These are second intentions, concepts about our concepts. Now, realists and nominalists debated fiercely about whether these second intentions pointed to real, common objects, universals, logical structures, or were just mental constructs we build through reflection. Even a nominalist like Occam accepted that logic deals with these second intentions. The key takeaway? There was strong consensus that the objects of logic are rational objects, whether real or constructed by the mind. Alright, let's dive into semantics with signification. This was the central semantic concept. But we need to be careful not to confuse signification with meaning. Signification is more like a psychological-causal property of terms, how they connect to something in the mind or world. Meaning, however, isn't typically seen as an entity a term relates to directly. Instead, we can say an utterance signifies or makes known an entity. Notice the difference. Meaning isn't transitive. The term doesn't mean something else, but signification is. The utterance signifies the thing. Lambert of Auxerre put it nicely: an utterance that's a sign of a concept, a sign of a sign, will be a sign of the thing signified. It's a sign of the concept directly, but a sign of the thing indirectly. Now, did they lack a notion of meaning? Absolutely not. They talked about sense, sensus, thought or meaning, sententia, and the force of a word, vis verbi. And they often used significatio and related terms quite broadly. There were actually two main, slightly conflicting ways medieval thinkers approached signification, both drawing from Aristotle's On Interpretation. The first approach, based on 16b 9-21, defined signifying as generating or establishing understanding. This puts the emphasis squarely on the hearer. If something leads to understanding, it signifies, regardless of the speaker's state of mind or intention. Under this view, even groans or animal cries could be considered significant if they conveyed some understanding. The second approach, based on 16a3-4, interpreted as spoken words are signs of concepts, shifts the focus to the speaker's intellectual capacity and intentions. Here, animal noises or groans might express feelings, but they aren't linked to concepts in the way language is, so they don't count as proper language. See the difference? One emphasizes the effect on the listener, the other the intent and capability of the speaker. Aristotle, as read by the medievals, went further, saying concepts themselves are signs of things. This raises a crucial question. What kind of thing do we understand when we hear man or animal? For centuries, the default assumption from Boethius onwards was that we understood some kind of universal, an essence or common nature. But this answer depended heavily on one's epistemology. For Augustine and Anselm, who believed in divine illumination allowing direct acquaintance with eternal ideas, the gap between knowing the word and knowing the thing was vast and important. Grasping the universal essence like rational mortal animal was grasping a real, intelligible reality. Anselm uses this distinction extensively in his arguments. For Aquinas, however, following Aristotle, knowledge starts with sense experience. Forming concepts depends on this sensory input, and moving from thinking about words to thinking about the actual things they represent is a much longer, more complex process, even with divine help. This idea of concepts sitting between words and things became the battleground for a major debate in the late 13th century. Do words signify concepts or things? Lambert of Auxerre suggested the intelligible species, the mental image or representation, was primary, with the essence being secondary. But Aquinas refined this. He distinguished between the intelligible species, part of the mental process, and the inner word or concept, the thing as thought about. This changed the debate. Does a word first signify the intelligible species as representing an external thing, or does it signify the inner word? If the inner word is purely mind-dependent, then concepts are primary. But if the inner word is identified with the external object as related by the mind, then things are primary. This latter view was championed by thinkers like Siger of Brabant, discussed by Scotus. The debate was heating up. Then, the 14th century rolls around, and nominalism takes center stage. This doctrine holds that only individual things truly exist. Concepts are just mental constructs. This flipped the debate again. The question became one of priority. Does a word signify an individual thing directly, or must it first signify the general concept, which is needed for signification to occur? Buridan argued concepts come first, explaining why words like being and one, which apply to the same things, still have different meanings. Occam, however, preferred to say words signify individuals while being governed by concepts. Interestingly, both thinkers emphasized that the concept itself acts as a representative sign. The focus shifted again, driven by this rising nominalist tide. Another big question was whether language is conventional or natural. Aristotle and Boethius clearly leaned towards convention. But this clashed with interpretations of Genesis 2:19, where Adam names the animals. Was Adam's language natural, somehow intrinsically linked to the essences of things? This created tension between biblical readings, emphasizing a natural link, though rejecting simple onomatopoeia and Aristotelian logic, stressing conventionality. Thierry of Chartres offered a creative synthesis. God's creative words gave essence to things, and Adam, inspired by the Holy Spirit, used those very words to name them. This, he argued, could still align with Boethius's conventional view. Later thinkers like Pseudo-Kilwardby and Aquinas insisted that the original act of imposing names, imposition, had to be a rational, deliberate act. Aquinas suggested this rationality came from the inner word capturing the essence, not from some magical sound-essence connection. If spoken language is conventional, what about inner language? The natural assumption was that there must be a natural inner language corresponding to it. The idea of inner discourse, logos and diathetos, was already around in Greek philosophy by the 2nd century BCE. Initially, it seems less like a silent conventional language and more like genuine internal thought processes, perhaps not yet fully grammatical. This notion became crucial when discussing what makes humans unique compared to animals, even clever ones like parrots. Early Christians split on this. Neoplatonists, via Aristotle and Boethius, passed the idea of inner discourse to Latin logicians. But theologians like Augustine used the inner word concept differently, trying to connect the divine logos to Christ, focusing on the active nature of the inner word rather than linguistic parallels. These two streams collided in the 13th century universities, where Aquinas played a huge role in integrating and reshaping them. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, we see deep dives into the nature of conceptual representation, whether the mental word is an act, an object, or a thing, and the distinction between reflecting on spoken words versus having independent inner discourse. This brings us to William of Ockham in the 14th century, who developed a really sophisticated version of what we'd call the language of thought hypothesis. He drew a sharp line between spoken language, with its conventional signs, and the underlying mental terms or concepts. These mental terms, for Ockham, were representative signs, significant by their very nature, and shared by all with similar sense experiences. Just like spoken language has grammar, so does mental language. Mental terms combine into structured compositions, though perhaps simpler grammatically, focusing only on essential features like number singular plural for nouns. At the semantic level, the truth of mental propositions depends on the reference of the subject and predicate concepts and the syntactic structure. Occam's theory was remarkably influential, shaping discussions well into the 16th century. It provided a powerful framework for understanding thought itself. Okay, we've mostly talked about substantial terms like man or animal, but what about other types of terms? Let's look at concrete accidental terms, sometimes called paronyms or denominatives, like literate or white. These are tricky because they don't fit neatly into Aristotle's neat categories. They seem to relate to substances. Only substances can be literate or white, but they also denote qualities, literacy, whiteness. Plus, unlike English adjectives, they can be subjects in Latin sentences. Priscian said nouns signify substance plus quality, while Aristotle insisted on distinct categories, with white signifying only quality. Anselm tackled this early in his De Grammatico, distinguishing between signification and naming, appellatio. He argued Aristotle was only concerned with signification. For Anselm, man signifies and names a substance, qualified, but literate signifies the quality directly, per se, and names the man, the subject of the quality, indirectly, per aliud. Later discussions, influenced by Avicenna and Averroes, continued this debate, culminating in Occam's reversal. For Occam, album, white, primarily signifies the thing, and it connotes the form of whiteness that qualifies it. This question of accidental terms connects to another issue, words sharing roots like white and whiteness. How can they be unified semantically? The key tool here was distinguishing between the thing signified, res significata, and the grammarian's modes of signifying, which distinguish abstract concrete, noun verb adjective, gender case, etc. William of Conches pointed out that white and whiteness differ in modes of signifying. One is a noun, one is an abstract noun, but not in the thing signified. Both point to whiteness. This distinction became super important for religious language. Aquinas argued that words like wise or good signify pure perfections, but they carry creaturely modes of signifying, suggesting separable qualities. Their abstract counterparts, wisdom and goodness, also have the wrong modes. We don't normally say wisdom is a man. To speak meaningfully about God, we need to strip away these creaturely modes for both concrete and abstract terms. But the central problem remains. Even if we cancel out the modes, how is God's perfection attributed differently than ours? The answer lies in doctrines of God's simplicity and transcendence, heavily discussed by Augustine and Boethius in works on the Trinity. They argued God transcends Aristotle's categories and is absolutely simple, no distinctions within God between essence and existence, or between different perfections like goodness and wisdom. As Boethius puts it, when we say God is just, we mention a quality, but not an accidental one. It's substantial, even supersubstantial. For God being just and being God are one and the same. Some theologians, influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius, pushed further with negative theology. We can't positively affirm anything about God, better to deny properties. God is not good, not existent. This raises the huge problem. How can we speak meaningfully of God at all? And specifically, how can we say God is just and Peter is just? By the mid-13th century, theologians turned to analogy as the key. The discussion of analogy was framed within the existing logical framework of equivocal terms. Aristotle's categories gives us examples: equivocal animal real versus picture, univocal animal human versus ox, and paronymously, strong, literate, concrete accidents. The sophistical refutations discusses equivocation leading to fallacies. Metaphysics provided deeper inspiration. Aristotle notes being ens has many senses, but relates to one central point, introducing focal meaning, pros hen equivocation. Avicenna calls being a notion, intentio, where subordinates agree according to prior and posterior. These transcendental terms, being one, good, true, apply across Aristotle's categories and are linked to pure perfections and concrete accidentals. In the 13th century, three main types of analogy emerged. First, analogy of proportionality comparing relations, point, spring, river. Second, and most central, analogy of attribution relating primary and secondary things, dog health, food healthy, marked by the prior and posterior sense. Third, analogy of imitation participation likeness between God and creatures, creatures good because they imitate God's goodness. By the 14th century, the focus on analogy shifted. Less about linguistic usage, more about the nature of the corresponding concepts. Is there one concept or a sequence? How are they ordered, formal versus objective concepts? Some, like Scotus, even rejected analogy altogether. Meanwhile, another avenue explored ambiguity, not in single terms, but in whole propositions. A key tool here is the distinction between compounded and divided senses, originating in Aristotle's discussion of fallacies. Take, a seated man can walk. Compounded sense, de dicto, that a seated man walks is possible. False. Divided sense, a seated man has the ability to walk. True. This distinction became standard for analyzing modal logic, ensuring we correctly interpret premises and conclusions. William Heytesbury's work shows how widely this was applied. Now for a major innovation from the 12th century, supposition theory. This had deep theological roots, especially in the doctrine of the Trinity. The word suppositum had dual uses. In grammar it meant subject, in theology it meant person. This led to the key notion of suppositio pro, standing for. So God supposits for a person of the Trinity, or for the divine essence. Developed further, supposition theory analyzed how subject and predicate terms refer in different contexts. The three main types were material supposition, where the term stands for itself or other occurrences, like in man is a noun. Simple supposition, where it stands for a universal, like in man is a species, sparking debates about universals. And personal supposition, where it refers to its usual objects, like man referring to Socrates, Plato, etc. Debates raged around personal supposition. Was it accidental or natural, allowing reference to all instances, past, present, future, or purely propositional and contextual? This tied into defining supposition itself. Is it a type of signification, or just accepting a term stands for its reference? Related ideas were ampliation, extending reference, and restriction, the opposite. Parisian logicians like Jean Lepage, around 1235, accepted natural supposition, arguing terms naturally refer to all instances in scientific propositions, universal truths, so no ampliation is needed there. Thus, non-scientific propositions restrict supposition. English logicians in the 13th century, however, insisted all supposition is contextual, requiring ampliation whenever the subject refers beyond current existence. Ampliation was crucial for analyzing tense, modality, and epistemic verbs like imagine. Generally, affirmative propositions with non-referring terms were seen as false. But wait, many true statements involve non-existence, past events, future possibilities. Ampliation allowed reference to extend over these. Marsilius of Ingen in the late 14th century even argued for ampliation to imaginable impossible objects, allowing I imagine a chimera to be true while a chimera is an animal remains false. Within personal supposition, four types were most common, often illustrated by descent to singulars. Determinate supposition, subject of some A is B, allows inference to a disjunction, this A is B, or that A is B. Purely confused supposition, predicate of every A is B, allows inference to a disjoint predicate, every A is this B or that B. Confused and distributive supposition, subject of every A is B, allows inference to a conjunction, this A is B and that A is B. Collective supposition, every man is hauling a boat together, descent involves a conjoint subject, this man and that man, are all hauling. Some distinguished mobile, descent possible and immobile cases, no descent like only every A is B. What was this used for? Solving problems like promising. If I promise you a horse, which horse? Walter Burley suggested horse has simple supposition. Heytesbury argued it has purely confused supposition initially, gaining determinate supposition only before the verb. Occam preferred a more complex formulation. You will have one horse by means of my gift. Different solutions to the same puzzle. Language and logic are all about truth, but what is truth? This question got tangled up with Aristotle's claim that truth depends on the actual thing existing or not, the doctrine of transcendentals, 1. Good, being, true being identical and graded, and Christ's declaration, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Augustine, in On Free Choice of the Will, used propositional truth as a stepping stone to argue God is truth. Since truths exist, there must be a truth they participate in, and that can only be God. He also used a paradox, attributed to Bonaventure. If there's no truth, then it's true there's no truth, therefore there's a first truth. Anselm did something similar in his Monologion. In De Veritate, he tackled different senses of truth as rectitude, applying it first to God, then to objects reflecting divine ideas, then to statements reflecting the truth of objects. Aquinas, however, rejected these Platonic leaps. Starting from the world, not propositions, he adopted Isaac Israeli's definition. Truth is the commensurateness of understanding and thing, adequatio intellectus et re. He saw two kinds of conformity, mind to object, leading to true judgments, and object to mind, transcendental truth, objects reflecting divine ideas. God is truth because in him, being and understanding are identical. One of the thorniest issues in truth is the insolubles, or semantic paradoxes. The classic example is the liar paradox. What I am saying is false. Say that's all you're saying. Medieval logicians grappled with this and more complex versions involving hypotheticals or chains of mutual reference. In our modern era, these paradoxes shake the foundations of semantic theory, forcing elaborate distinctions between language and metalanguage. But the medievals know crisis mentality. While they did employ restrictions on self-reference and some language metalanguage ideas, their techniques were generally tailored specifically to handle these tricky cases, not overhaul their entire semantic framework. Inference, or consequentia, was the heart of logic. All that work on signification and reference? It was meant to help avoid fallacies. Treatises on obligations, practice in following logical implications. There was serious debate about validity. The standard definition, valid if impossible for consequent to be false when antecedent is true, faced challenges. First, propositions might not exist, no truth value, or have mismatched meaning expression. Buridan solved this by shifting to a definition based on signification. Impossible for it to be as signified by antecedent without it being as signified by consequent. Second, the if and only if formulation raised problems. If truth suffices for validity, we accept paradoxes like anything follows from a falsehood. Attempts to add conditions arose. Abelard's containment principle, Kilward b. Streitrode's requirement that the consequent be understood in the antecedent, 13th century focus on capturing causal relations. Antecedent must be possible. Some resisted paradoxes. Others, like the Parvipontani and Buridan, embraced the if definition and its consequences. We've touched on many overlapping areas where logic, philosophy, and theology intersect. Often these discussions frame logic as a study of inference, not just a search for truth. Augustine nailed this. Knowing the rules of inference is one thing. Knowing the truth of propositions is another. He cautioned against mistaking mastery of inference rules for understanding the truth of the blessed life. For the medieval thinker, logic was undeniably a preliminary study, a necessary tool, but never the ultimate destination. It prepared the mind for higher pursuits. That wraps up our whirlwind tour.